Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
An unknown woman called me and said, "I am pregnant by your husband. We have been together for 5 years." My husband was right next to me. I put it on speaker. He went pale. What I did next made him, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to believe that a good marriage was something you built, brick by brick, over years of small sacrifices and quiet patience. I believed that if you were loyal, if you showed up, if you loved someone the right way, they would love you back the same way. I was 34 years old, living in a 3-bedroom house in a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina, and I thought my life was exactly what it was supposed to be. His name was Daniel. Daniel Mercer. We met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's dinner party, and I remember thinking he had the kind of face that made you feel safe. Square jaw, steady eyes, a laugh that filled a room without demanding attention. We dated for 2 years before he proposed on a hiking trail in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the ring in his jacket pocket, the sky going pink behind the trees. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. We had been married for 6 years when that phone call came. Those 6 years weren't perfect. No marriage is. But they were real. We had a dog named Biscuit, a golden retriever who slept across both our feet. We had Sunday morning pancakes and arguments about whose turn it was to unload the dishwasher. I worked as a project manager at a mid-sized logistics company downtown. Daniel was a sales director at a medical supply firm. We had plans. We were saving for a renovation on the back deck. We talked, occasionally, carefully, about maybe trying for a baby. Looking back now, I can see exactly where the cracks started. But at the time, I told myself stories. That's what we do, isn't it? We narrate our own lives in ways that let us keep going. The first sign came about 18 months before everything fell apart. Daniel started working late. Not every night. That would have been too obvious. Just twice a week, sometimes 3 times. He'd come home after 9, smelling of a long day, and he'd be distracted in a way that felt new. Not tired. Somewhere else. I asked him once, casually over dinner, "Big project?" He said yes. He named a client. The name meant nothing to me, but it sounded real enough that I nodded and let it go. Then came the phone. It had always been left on the kitchen counter when we were home together. One of those small, unspoken intimacies of a married couple. Somewhere around that same period, the phone started coming everywhere with him. Bathroom. Garage. Even to bed. Screen down on the nightstand. I told myself he was stressed about work. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the body knows things before the mind admits them. I started sleeping badly. I'd wake at 3 in the morning with a tightness in my chest I couldn't explain. I lost a few pounds without trying. My best friend, Marisol, asked me twice if everything was okay. I said yes, both times, and I almost believed it. Then, there were the small disappearances from our joint account. Not large amounts. Never anything dramatic. $60 here, $90 there. Charges at restaurants I didn't recognize, in neighborhoods neither of us had mentioned visiting. I told myself he was grabbing lunch with clients. I told myself it was nothing. It was a Tuesday in March when everything ended. I was in the kitchen, finishing the last of a cup of coffee before heading back to my home office. Biscuit was asleep under the table. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling through something on his laptop, relaxed in a way that would haunt me later. My phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did. The voice on the other end was a woman's, calm, measured, with just enough of a tremor underneath to tell me she had rehearsed this. "Is this Lauren Mercer?" "Yes," I said. "My name is Christine. I think you and I need to talk." A pause. "I'm pregnant. The baby is Daniel's. We've been together for 5 years." The room didn't spin. That's not what happened. Everything went very, very still. Daniel was 3 feet away from me. I looked at him. He hadn't looked up yet. My thumb found the speakerphone button before I'd made any conscious decision. The sound filled the kitchen. "Could you repeat that?" I said. My voice was level. "I don't know how." She repeated it, and that was when Daniel looked up. I watched the color leave his face in a single slow wave, from his forehead down, like a curtain being drawn. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. What did I do next? I didn't scream. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't cry. I set my coffee mug down on the counter very carefully, so it wouldn't break. And then I looked at my husband, the man with the steady eyes and the safe face, the man I had built 6 years of my life beside. And I said quietly and clearly, "Don't say a single word." He tried to speak anyway. That was Daniel, even caught, even cornered, even with Christine's voice still hanging in the air of our kitchen like smoke. He tried to manage the situation. That was who he was. I could see it now, suddenly and completely, the way you finally see a shape in one of those optical illusions. A man who had been managing me for years. "Lauren, listen." I said, "Don't." He closed his mouth. Christine had gone quiet on the phone. I think she hadn't expected this version of me either. Maybe she'd expected tears. Maybe she'd expected me to hang up and turn on Daniel. Maybe she'd expected to be the one in control of what happened next. I told her I would call her back, and I ended the call. Then I picked up my coffee, walked to my home office, closed the door, and sat down at my desk. What I did in that room for the next 2 hours was take stock. I've always been a project manager at heart. It's not just a job title. It's a way of thinking. You assess the situation. You identify your assets and your liabilities. You don't make decisions while you're flooded with emotion, because flooded decisions are almost always the wrong ones. So I sat there and I breathed and I took stock. The assets. The house was in both our names, purchased 6 years ago, currently worth considerably more than we'd paid. We had joint savings, around $40,000. I had my own income, my own career, my own credit history, established entirely independently. I had a circle of people who loved me. And I had, it turned out, 6 years of receipts. The liabilities. I was emotionally devastated in a way I hadn't yet fully processed. I had no idea of the legal landscape I was walking into. I didn't know what Christine actually wanted or what Daniel had promised her. And I was living, at that moment, with the person who had done this to me, under the same roof, sharing a bed, sharing a dog, sharing a life that had apparently been a partial fiction for 5 out of 6 years. Was this my fault? I sat with that question for a long time. No, it wasn't. But I also knew that the legal system, the financial system, the social system, none of them would protect me automatically. I had to protect myself. I opened a new document on my computer and I started writing. Not a journal, not an emotional purge, a timeline. Every suspicious moment I could remember, dating back 18 months. Every charge I'd noticed on the account. Every late night. Every time Daniel's phone had been face down on the nightstand. I wrote it all out, factually, with dates where I had them, with approximate notations where I didn't. By the time I finished, it was almost noon. Daniel had knocked on the office door twice. I hadn't answered. Fear lived in me that entire morning. I want to be honest about that. Not just the fear of losing the life I'd built, but a deeper, uglier fear that I had been foolish, that I had missed things I should have seen, that people would look at me and think, how did she not know? But somewhere underneath the fear, something else was hardening. A kind of cold, clear resolve that felt almost unfamiliar, like a muscle I hadn't used in years. I opened a browser window and I searched for family law attorneys in Charlotte. I was looking for someone with a specific kind of reputation, not aggressive and flashy, but methodical. Someone who built cases carefully. Within an hour, I had 3 names. Then I did something I hadn't done in 6 years of marriage. I opened a personal bank account, just mine, at a different bank from our joint one. I transferred exactly half of my last paycheck into it. Not a dollar more. I wasn't going to do anything that could be characterized as hiding marital assets. I was simply establishing a financial foothold that was mine alone. The plan was still forming, but its shape was becoming clear. I would document everything, consult a lawyer before making any visible move, and most importantly, I would not let Daniel know what I was doing until I was ready. The moment he understood I was preparing, he would start preparing too. And he had a 5-year head start on deception. That afternoon, I walked out of the office and into the kitchen. Daniel was still there. He had made himself a sandwich he hadn't eaten. He looked like a man waiting for a verdict. "Are you going to talk to me?" he asked. I opened the refrigerator, took out the pitcher of iced tea, and poured myself a glass. I looked at him the way you look at a problem you've already decided how to solve. "Not yet," I said, and I went back to work. The attorney's name was Sandra Howell. I found her through a recommendation tucked inside a Google review that mentioned, specifically, her calm under pressure and her attention to financial detail. Those 2 qualities were exactly what I needed. Her office was in a quiet building near Uptown Charlotte, all neutral carpeting and indirect lighting, and a waiting room that felt deliberately undramatic, as if the space itself was reminding you to stay composed. I had made the appointment under my maiden name. A small precaution, perhaps paranoid. But I had begun to understand that I was operating in a situation where small precautions were the difference between being prepared and being caught off guard. Sandra Howell was in her early 50s, with reading glasses she wore on a chain and the steady, unhurried manner of someone who had heard every version of this story and could no longer be shocked by any of them. I laid out what I knew in the same order I had written it on my timeline. Factually, with dates, without editorial. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk and looked at me for a moment. "North Carolina is an equitable distribution state," she said. "Not a 50-50 split automatically. A court looks at contributions, circumstances, length of marriage. Given the duration here, and assuming no prenuptial agreement, there wasn't one. You're in a reasonable position. But," she paused, "if adultery can be demonstrated, legally demonstrated, not just alleged, it can affect the division of marital assets in your favor. North Carolina still recognizes fault in divorce proceedings." That word, legally demonstrated, it changed the shape of everything. I asked her what that meant practically. It meant documentation. financial records, phone records if obtainable, testimony. It meant that the timeline I'd already written was a beginning, but only a beginning. I needed more. I needed something a court would take seriously. She also told me, quietly, that Christine's pregnancy, if Daniel was indeed the father, would almost certainly factor into support calculations, and that the sooner I formally initiated proceedings, the clearer the financial picture would be when everything was divided. I left her office with a legal consultation agreement signed and a list of steps in my hand. The following week, I began gathering. I went through the joint bank statements going back 2 years, printed them at the office, where Daniel would not see them. I organized the charges by date, cross-referenced them with Daniel's claimed locations on nights he'd worked late. There were patterns. A restaurant in Noda, a neighborhood neither of us frequented, appearing on 4 separate Friday evenings. A hotel charge in Asheville from the weekend Daniel had told me he attended a sales conference. I found the conference itinerary online. It had ended at noon on Saturday. The hotel checkout was Sunday morning. I photographed everything with my personal phone. I emailed the images to a private Gmail account I had created with a password Daniel had never seen. Then came the moment I hadn't planned for. A Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the phone call. Daniel had been walking on eggshells around me, quieter, more careful, watching me in a way I recognize now as someone who is trying to gauge how much you know. He had attempted the conversation twice more. Both times I had redirected. I came home from work to find him standing in the kitchen, phone to his ear. He startled when he heard the door. The call ended faster than it naturally would have. "Who was that?" I asked, not as an accusation, just a question casually while I set my bag down. "Client," he said. That night, I checked the Verizon account. We were still on a joint plan, another detail I had noted and not yet acted on, because changing it prematurely would signal my intentions. The bill listed outgoing calls. The number that appeared repeatedly, most recently that Thursday evening, was Christine's. He was still in contact with her. Of course he was. She was pregnant with his child. But the call that Thursday was 9 minutes long. Long enough to be a strategy conversation. Long enough for 2 people who understood they were in trouble to be figuring out how to manage it. That was the moment, standing in the bathroom with the Verizon statement pulled up on my phone, that I fully understood I was not dealing only with a cheating husband. I was dealing with 2 people who had, for 5 years, coordinated their deception. 2 people who were now coordinating their response to being caught. I thought about calling Sandra Howell that night. Instead, I saved a screenshot of the call log, emailed it to my private account, and went to bed. Was I afraid? Yes, but not in the way I'd been afraid before. This was a different kind of fear, the kind that sharpens you rather than paralyzes you. The next morning, I called Sandra's office and I said I was ready to move forward. Sandra filed the petition for divorce on a Wednesday. I was in my office when she called to confirm it had been submitted. I remember I was on the phone with a shipping vendor when her name appeared on the other line, and I asked the vendor if I could call him back. And then I sat for a moment in the quiet of my office before I answered her call. "It's filed," she said. "Okay," I said. That was all. The words sat in the air like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples hadn't started yet, but I knew they were coming. Daniel was served 2 days later, on a Friday afternoon, at his office. Sandra had arranged it deliberately, during business hours, at his place of work, in a building where he'd spent years cultivating the image of a composed, successful professional. He called me 7 times in the following hour. I let all 7 calls go to voicemail. When I arrived home that evening, his car was already in the driveway. He was inside, not in the kitchen, not in the living room, but standing in the hallway. Just standing there, jacket still on, the served papers in his hand. The look on his face was something I hadn't seen before. Not the pale shock of the kitchen. This was something harder, something angry. "You hired a lawyer," he said, without talking to me. "You had a 5-year relationship," I said, without talking to me. He made an argument, several arguments in rapid succession, the way people do when they've rehearsed for one version of a conversation and gotten another. He said this wasn't the way to handle it. He said we could still talk. He said he wanted to try counseling. I walked past him into the kitchen. What I hadn't fully anticipated was Christine. 2 days after Daniel was served, she appeared at my door. I don't know what I expected Christine to look like. Someone with the certainty of a woman who had believed for 5 years that she was the real relationship and I was the problem. She was around my age, maybe a year or 2 younger, dark-haired, professionally dressed, visibly pregnant now, maybe 5 months. She stood on my porch with the posture of someone who had prepared a speech. "I just want to talk," she said. I told her anything she needed to say to me could go through my attorney. Then she showed me the threat that had been building behind her composed exterior. "You need to understand," she said, her voice dropping, becoming something harder, "that I have a child on the way, and Daniel has told me things about your finances, about this house, that a family court judge might find very interesting. If you push this, I will make sure that what gets divided is divided in a way that accounts for this child." The arrogance of it, standing on my front porch, presenting my own home to me as a negotiating chip. "Are you threatening me?" I asked. "I'm informing you," she said. "There's a difference." I looked at her for one long moment. "You'll be hearing from Sandra Howell," I said. And I closed the door, but she wasn't finished. That weekend, Daniel and Christine, apparently now fully united in strategy, filed a counter-response through Daniel's attorney. It raised a set of claims about the household finances that were not only false, but specific in a way that told me Daniel had been feeding Christine information about our marriage for years. They alleged that I had hidden personal income. They alleged that the house was primarily funded by Daniel's salary. Both claims were demonstrably false. I had the records. But the ugliness of seeing those words in a legal document, seeing my marriage turned into a lie on paper, was something I hadn't quite prepared for. Marisol came over that Saturday and sat with me at the kitchen table while I went through the counterfiling. She read each page alongside me, quietly, without performing outrage. At the end, she said, "They're scared, Lauren. This is what scared people do." She was right, and she was right about something else, too. "You need to rest," she said. "Not now, in a few days. You need to take a breath before the next round." So I did. I took 4 days. I took personal time from work. I booked 3 nights at a small inn in Asheville, in the mountains where Daniel had been the weekend he'd told me was a work conference. I don't know why I chose Asheville specifically. Maybe reclaiming it. Maybe just because the mountains had always steadied me. I left on a Tuesday with Biscuit in the back seat, and no plans except hiking and sleep. And for 3 days, I didn't read a single legal document. I walked trails. I ate dinner alone at tables with good views. I slept 10 hours a night. When I came back, I was ready. The attempt at temptation came on a Monday evening, 10 days after I returned from Asheville. I was sitting on the back porch with a glass of wine. Daniel had moved to his brother's apartment 3 weeks earlier, which had been my condition for not immediately filing for a temporary order requiring him to vacate. When my phone rang, it was Daniel. Not a text, not an email through attorneys, a direct call. I let it ring twice, then answered. His voice was different, softer, the careful, modulated warmth I recognized from early in our relationship, the voice he used when he wanted something. Lauren, I know you don't want to hear from me directly. I need you to know that I still love you. What happened with Christine was. He paused, constructing it. It was a mistake that got out of control. I should have ended it years ago. I know that. And I know I don't have the right to ask anything. But I'm asking you, can we just talk? Before the lawyers take everything from both of us? The lawyers taking everything. I noticed the framing. Daniel, I said, you can have your attorney contact Sandra. Lauren. Good night, Daniel. I hung up and topped off my wine glass and watched the evening settle over the yard. Biscuit lay in the grass below the porch steps, one ear raised in my direction. I wasn't shaken. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't shaken in the least. What I felt was something closer to recognition. I had heard this voice before, in smaller moments. The voice he used to deflect, to redirect, to transform his failures into shared problems. The lawyers taking everything from both of us. As if we were two people equally victimized by the legal system, rather than one person who had been systematically lied to for 5 of 6 years. Christine was quieter, but Sandra had told me that Daniel's attorney had been in contact, probing, asking procedural questions that suggested they were assessing whether I would negotiate. They were waiting to see if the 4 days in Asheville had softened me. They were looking for a crack. There was no crack. What I had instead was a growing foundation. The first piece of it was Marisol, who had already proven herself in the kitchen that Saturday. She was more than a best friend. She was a witness. She had noticed things over the years. The late nights, the distracted Daniel, the time she'd called our house and he hadn't mentioned it to me. She was willing to provide a written statement to Sandra's office, and she did. The second piece was my colleague Donna, who worked in our company's finance department. Donna had, entirely by coincidence, run into Daniel at a restaurant in Noda on one of those Friday evenings, one of the receipts I'd identified. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time. She thought plenty of it now. She wrote down what she remembered. The date, the restaurant, the woman sitting across from him. She had never met Christine, but her description matched. The third piece was my mother. Not as a legal witness, but as the person who reminded me, in a phone call that lasted 2 hours, of who I had been before Daniel and who I still was. She was 71 years old and did not traffic in softness when the situation didn't call for it. You finish what you started, she told me, and then you live a good life. That's the only revenge that means anything. I wrote that down. I still have it. Sandra's office called midweek. The financial discovery process had turned up something neither of us had expected. A joint account between Daniel and Christine. Not a savings account, a checking account opened 4 years ago, with regular deposits that matched the unexplained charges I'd been tracking. He had been financially supporting her life from money that, at least partially, moved through our marital finances. That was the kind of documentation that didn't require a judge's interpretation. It spoke for itself. I sat in Sandra's office on a Thursday afternoon, and she laid it all out across her desk. The bank records, Donna's statement, Marisol's statement, the hotel receipt from Asheville, the call logs. She looked at it the way a contractor looks at a completed foundation. "They'll want to settle," she said. "I know," I said. "Do you want to settle?" I thought about it genuinely, for 30 full seconds. "I want what's fair," I said, "and I want it on the record." Sandra nodded. "Then we go to court." They came together. That was what surprised me. Not that they came, but that they came as a pair, as a unit, presenting themselves as though their solidarity was a form of legitimacy. It was a Saturday morning, 3 weeks before the court date Sandra had scheduled. I was in the kitchen making coffee when the doorbell rang. I looked through the front window before opening the door. Daniel was standing on the porch in a jacket I'd given him 2 Christmases ago. Whether that was deliberate or unconscious, I couldn't say. Christine stood beside him, no longer in the sharp, professional clothes she'd worn the first time. She was in softer colors, a muted sage green that I suspected had been chosen carefully. Her hair was down instead of pulled back. Her posture was careful and practiced, and her expression had been arranged into something that was meant to read as penitence. She looked, in other words, like a woman who had spent time in front of a mirror, preparing to look like a woman who hadn't. I opened the door, but not the screen. "Lauren," Daniel said, "we know you don't owe us anything. We're not here to fight. We wanted to come and say some things in person." I looked at them both, and I thought, they've rehearsed this. Not poorly. Daniel was good at this. He had always been good at reading a room and meeting it where it was. But I had 6 years of knowing how he constructed things. And I could see the architecture clearly now. The way you can see the frame of a house once the walls have been stripped away. "You have 5 minutes," I said, "on the porch." I stepped outside, which meant the screen door was behind me, and I was still physically close to it. A small thing, but I noticed it in myself. I had instinctively created a path back. Some part of me was still being careful. Christine spoke first, which told me she had been designated the emotional lead. Her voice was low, and she put one hand over her stomach. Not theatrically, but with the precise calibration of a gesture that she knew would be visible. "I know I'm the last person you want to see. I'm not here to defend what happened. I have a baby coming, and the last thing I want is to destroy everyone's life over this. I made mistakes. Daniel made mistakes. But the way this is going..." She glanced at Daniel. "A court case is going to cost everyone. And for what?" There it was. The frame. For what? As if the purpose of legal proceedings was punishment, and I was being petty. As if I was the one who had introduced conflict into an otherwise peaceful situation. "The baby deserves stability," Daniel said, picking up the thread with practiced smoothness. "I've already told my attorney I want to come to a fair arrangement. I'm not trying to take anything from you, Lauren. But if this goes to court, the legal fees alone, it guts both of us. Is that really what you want?" "My attorney handles my legal fees," I said. "Lauren." His voice changed, softened into something that was almost an apology, almost intimate, almost the voice from the Blue Ridge Mountains with the ring in his jacket pocket. "You know me. You know I'm not a bad person. Things got complicated. That's not who I am at my core." And there it was, the real one. The thing beneath all the staging. "You know I'm not a bad person." It was the thing he had always been able to say to me, and it had always worked, because I had always wanted it to be true. I had loved this man. I had built a life alongside him. Part of me, if I let it, could still feel the weight of that. The Sunday mornings, the dog, the deck we'd never gotten around to building, and he knew it. He was counting on it. But I also knew, with the kind of knowledge that doesn't come from argument but from experience, that this was precisely what this visit was designed to produce. They hadn't come to apologize. They had come to stand on my porch and remind me that I had loved him and let that reminder do the work. Christine's soft green sweater, Daniel's old Christmas jacket, her hand on her stomach. It was all set dressing. A production designed for an audience of one. "I think you both need to leave," I said. Christine's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough. The softness fell away like a coat she'd been holding closed and finally dropped. "Do you understand what a judge is going to see when Daniel's attorney presents the support claims for this child? You are going to come out of this with significantly less than you think. We can make this very complicated for you, Lauren. More complicated than you've planned for. Leave," I said, "or I call Sandra and she adds this visit to the file." Daniel put his hand on Christine's arm. Not gently, more like a restraint. He looked at me one more time. And whatever he was looking for, he didn't find it. His expression shifted through several things in quick succession. Calculation, frustration, and finally, something colder and more deliberate. The performance was over. What was underneath it was not soft. "You're making a mistake," he said. His voice was quiet now, which was somehow worse than if he'd raised it. "We'll see," I said. They walked back to his car without another word. I watched them go, Christine moving stiffly, Daniel with his hand at the small of her back in a gesture that might have looked caring to anyone watching from a distance. I stayed on the porch until the car turned off the street and disappeared around the corner. Then I went inside and I locked the door, the deadbolt, and then the chain, which I didn't usually use. And I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, with my heart going harder than I would have liked. The coffee I'd been making when they arrived had gone cold. I poured it out and made a fresh cup and stood at the counter while it brewed. Was I afraid? Yes. In the way that you're afraid after a thing has passed, the body catching up to what the mind already knew. Daniel's last look had been different from anything I'd seen in him before. It had been the look of someone who had stopped pretending, and stopped pretending not only about Christine and the marriage, but about me, about what I was and wasn't capable of. He had decided, somewhere in the preceding weeks, that I was more formidable than he'd accounted for. That look told me so. And Christine's dropped composure, the hardness that had come through it, that told me she had always been harder underneath than the soft green sweater was meant to suggest. But that fear, that specific sharpened version of it, clarified something important. If he was dropping the performance, it meant he was running low on options. People who are winning don't abandon their strategy. Frightened people who are losing don't become kinder or more honest out of genuine growth. They become more direct because they've run out of more elegant tools. That directness, paradoxically, was the most honest thing he'd been in years. I could work with honesty. I had spent months learning to work with it. I called Sandra that evening and told her about the visit, recounting it with as much specific detail as I could remember. Christine's exact words about making things complicated. Daniel's final statement. She listened, asked 2 clarifying questions, and said we'd add it to the file. I told her to proceed on the original timeline. I wasn't moving the court date. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Judge Patricia Reeves presided, early 60s, iron gray hair, with the particular expression of someone who has heard an enormous quantity of human dishonesty and has long since stopped finding it surprising. Sandra had told me that was good. She doesn't need drama, Sandra said. She needs evidence. We have evidence. Daniel's attorney was a man named Carl Briggs, mid-40s, expensively suited, with the air of someone accustomed to winning on the strength of procedural confidence. He was good, Sandra had warned me. He was especially good at building narratives. The narrative he had been building, in the filings leading up to this day, was a specific one: that our marriage had been troubled for years, that both parties bore equal responsibility for its dissolution, and that Daniel's relationship with Christine, while regrettable in its timing, was not, legally speaking, the cause of the marital breakdown. He was attempting to neutralize the adultery question by framing it as a symptom rather than a cause, and by casting doubt on the extent to which marital finances had been used to support Christine. Briggs opened with confidence. What he did not know, because Sandra had been careful and deliberate about what was formally disclosed versus what remained in reserve, was the full scope of the joint account documentation. Sandra introduced it in the second hour of proceedings. The account had been opened by Daniel alone, with Christine listed as a secondary holder. Over 4 years, Daniel had made regular transfers into it from a personal account that drew, irregularly but consistently, from our joint marital account. The amounts were individually small. In aggregate, across 4 years, they totaled a number that made the courtroom go quiet for a moment when Sandra put it on the screen. $41,000, transferred from the financial ecosystem of our marriage into an account that had been used to fund another life. Briggs objected. The objection was overruled. Daniel's face, across the room, was the face of a man understanding that the floor had just disappeared. But it was what came next that I hadn't known was coming, that even Sandra hadn't known was fully coming, because the details had only been finalized the night before. Christine, as Daniel's attorney had been careful to note, had filed a separate paternity and support claim through her own attorney. Standard procedure when a child was involved. But in the process of that filing, Christine had provided documentation of her own. Documentation she believed supported her position that Daniel had made her explicit financial promises. Those text messages, now part of the court record, included one exchange in which Daniel, apparently in a moment of pressure from Christine, trying to keep the relationship intact, had written, "Don't worry about Lauren. She doesn't pay attention to the accounts. By the time this is over, I'll have what we need set aside." He had put it in writing. He had told her in a text message that he intended to extract money from our marriage to build a life with her, and that I was too inattentive to notice. Sandra read the message aloud, twice. I watched Daniel look at Christine across the room, the look of a man who has understood very late that the person he chose over his wife has just buried him with a text message she chose to disclose in her own legal interest. And Christine, to her credit or damnation, did not look back at him. Judge Reeves took 20 minutes to return her determination on the primary financial questions. Equitable distribution, in light of the documented dissipation of marital assets, was adjusted significantly in my favor. The house, the primary savings, the retirement accounts. The division landed where Sandra had hoped. Outside the courtroom, in the marble corridor, Daniel said one last thing to me. He had fired Briggs at some point during the recess, or Briggs had dropped him. I never found out which. He stood there in his expensive jacket, and he looked like someone who has been awake for 3 days. "I didn't think it would end like this," he said. I looked at him, this man with the safe face, the steady eyes, and I thought about everything I'd built with him and everything he'd spent without my knowledge. I thought about 6 years of Sunday pancakes, and a dog who'd slept across both our feet, and a ring on a mountain at sunset, and all of it being, at some level, partially true and partially not. "No," I said. "I know you didn't." And I walked out into the sunlight. The final divorce decree was issued on a Thursday. Sandra called me at 11 in the morning, and I was standing in what had been our shared home office, now just my office, when my phone rang. I had repainted the walls 2 weeks earlier, a deep, quiet blue that I'd chosen myself from a row of samples I'd taped to the wall and studied over 3 separate evenings without asking anyone's opinion. It was a color Daniel would not have liked. That had not been the primary reason I chose it, but it had not been irrelevant either. "It's official," Sandra said. I stood by the window and looked out at the backyard, the overgrown section near the fence where the deck would eventually be, and I said, "Okay." The word didn't feel small. It felt like a door closing on something that had taken a long time and a great deal to close properly. The terms were clear and final. I retained the house outright. Daniel's equity share to be bought out at current assessed value, drawn from his retirement accounts, which were more substantially funded than mine had been, in part because I had stepped back from 2 career advancement opportunities during our marriage to accommodate joint decisions that had been, in retrospect, primarily his preferences. The joint savings were divided with the adjusted split Judge Reeves had ordered, reflecting the documented dissipation. Daniel was liable for reimbursement of a portion of the $41,000, restructured into a formal payment schedule with legal enforcement provisions that Sandra had made certain were airtight. Biscuit, to whom no one in the proceedings had given any formal legal thought, had been with me every night since Daniel left. He was under my desk when Sandra called, one paw extended, chin on the floor, watching me with the calm of an animal that has no idea what a divorce decree is and requires no explanation. He would be staying. That had never been in question. Christine's situation resolved itself separately and entirely through its own logic. Her paternity and support claim had run on its own procedural track, and Daniel was now legally obligated for child support for a child not yet born. To a woman he had lost the financial infrastructure to support in the way he had been supporting her. The joint account was gone, dissolved in the proceedings. The marital money was no longer available to him. The text message, "She doesn't pay attention to the accounts," had become the sentence that defined the case, the one that Briggs had been unable to redirect away from, the one that had removed every remaining procedural option from Daniel's side of the table. Christine had written her own role in that outcome by choosing to disclose it in her own filing. She had protected herself from him and buried him simultaneously, and I was not sure she had fully understood, at the time she did it, that both of those things were happening at once. The sales director position ended 3 months after the trial. The official reason was a restructuring, which may have been true, or may have been the company's quiet response to the kind of public court record that is not difficult to find if someone looks. I never investigated. It wasn't my concern. What I knew was that Daniel was no longer the person who had introduced himself at a dinner party in his late 20s with the confident ease of a man on his way somewhere. He was instead a man rebuilding from a position considerably lower than the one he'd held, with new financial obligations and no surplus to absorb them. I signed the final paperwork in Sandra's office on a Friday afternoon. She handed me my copy in a manila envelope and shook my hand across the desk. A real handshake, firm, the kind that acknowledged what the previous year had actually required. I thanked her with something that felt inadequate for what she'd done, but she waved it off in the way of someone who has done this work for decades and understands that the moment of completion is its own sufficient acknowledgement. Outside her building, I sat in my car for a few minutes before driving. Not from grief. I want to be clear about that. I sat there because I needed a moment to locate myself in the new landscape. For more than a year, my life had been organized around a proceeding, a conflict, a set of documents and deadlines and strategic decisions. That structure was gone now. What remained was just the house, the job, the dog, the mountains on clear days, the deck that would be built, the life that was entirely mine to fill. I took Sandra to lunch the following week. We went to a restaurant in Noda, a good one I'd chosen without reference to any prior association, a place I had looked up myself on a Tuesday evening and decided I wanted to try. I ordered a glass of wine at noon. I didn't explain it to anyone. We talked about her daughter's college applications and whether the Blue Ridge trails were passable in November, and what I was going to plant in the narrow bed along the back fence once the deck was finished. It was an ordinary lunch. An ordinary Thursday afternoon in a city that had been the site of the worst and most clarifying year of my life. On the drive home, I took a route I rarely used, past a neighborhood I'd always meant to explore, and I rolled the windows down because the October air was cool and exact, and I had nowhere particular to be by any particular time. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat for a moment before going in. The dogwood tree, the one Daniel and I had planted together in the second year of the marriage, that neither of us had expected to take root as strongly as it had, was changing color at the tips of its branches. Deep red, edged with gold. It had nothing to do with either of us anymore. It was just a tree, doing what trees do, indifferent and beautiful. I was 35 years old. The deck contractor started Monday. I had already chosen the wood. The renovation was finished by late September, and I had a dinner party on the new deck on a Saturday evening in October, with string lights and a table that seated 10, and weather that felt like a gift. Marisol was there, and Donna, and my mother, who had driven up from Wilmington and sat in her usual kitchen chair and told me the deck looked beautiful. It did. I didn't host that dinner as a statement or a celebration of survival, though it was quietly both. I hosted it because I liked to cook, and I liked the people around that table. And for a long time, the shape of my life had been determined by someone else's preferences. Now it wasn't. It was mine to determine. My work had been going well. With the clarity that came from the previous year's upheaval, I had pursued a senior director position I'd been hesitant to go after, while managing the low-grade anxiety of an eroding marriage. I was offered it in August and accepted without consulting anyone except myself. The salary increase was significant. I started hiking again, seriously, on weekends. The Blue Ridge Mountains, which had been the site of a proposal I now thought of with complicated but clear-eyed realism. I went alone mostly, occasionally with Marisol. The trails steadied me the way they always had. Altitude simplifies your thinking into just the next step. I needed that. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I met someone at a hiking trail association event. His name was Thomas, a landscape architect, quiet and specific about the things he cared about. We started hiking together on Sunday mornings. It grew slowly, without urgency, the way things grow when you're no longer trying to outrun something. I didn't need him. That was new, and it was good. Daniel's life had restructured itself into something smaller. The sales director position had not been replaced by an equivalent one. He'd taken a mid-level role at a smaller firm at a substantially reduced salary. His financial obligations now included child support, the reimbursement order from the settlement, and the ordinary costs of rebuilding a life after dismantling one. The math was not kind to him, and it wasn't something I had any hand in. It was simply the arithmetic of choices. Christine had gotten what she wanted in the most technical sense. The man, the child, the acknowledged relationship. What she hadn't gotten was the version of those things she'd believed she was getting. The Daniel who arrived with reduced income and compounding legal obligations was not the Daniel she had constructed in her mind during 5 years of being the secret. I didn't take pleasure in their difficulty. I had finished taking inventory of what had been done to me, and I had nothing left to spend on them. What I had instead was the deck, the new position, the Sunday mornings on the trails, the dog asleep at the foot of the bed, and an October evening with string lights, and the mountains just visible on the horizon. It was a good life. It was mine. That was enough. Here is what I know now, standing on the other side of it all. The truth doesn't need you to chase it. Prepare your foundation, and it carries itself. I didn't destroy Daniel. I documented. I didn't confront Christine. I showed up in court. Every consequence they faced came from their own words, their own choices, their own text messages filed in their own legal proceedings. I just made sure I was in the room when it arrived. What would you have done? Standing in that kitchen, speakerphone on, watching the color drain from his face. Leave your answer below. Share this with someone who needs it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.